I remember that night like it was yesterday. He said he was going to the soccer game with his friends, a common Thursday night occurrence. But at 11 p.m., my phone vibrated with a strange notification. His location had been shared with me, something he couldn't even remember activating. It didn't show a court. It didn't show a stadium. It showed a lit-up bar on a random corner. My heart raced. For a second, I tried to convince myself it could just be a coincidence. Maybe he'd just passed by quickly. But the arrow on the map wouldn't budge. I stared at the screen as if in front of a broken mirror, reflecting everything I'd suspected for weeks. The lie was no longer just in the air. It was right before my eyes. In that moment, the silence of the house seemed to scream. I found myself standing in the living room, phone in hand, staring at the proof that something wasn't right. My breathing grew heavy, my hands sweaty. I knew that location wasn't just a dot on the map. It was the first piece of a painful puzzle I was about to put together. And nothing would ever be the same again. When I met him, we were two young dreamers. We were in a hurry to live, and believed that love would be enough to hold back the weight of the years. We built a home, a routine, and even a unique way of calling each other. He called me his calm after the storm. I believed him, unaware of what the future held. Our weekends were sacred. We went to the grocery store together, made simple dinners, and laughed about silly things on the couch. There was a Sunday morning ritual. He would make coffee and hand me a cup with a kiss. These little things reassured me we were on the right path. I never imagined these gestures would begin to fade. Over time, I noticed his messages became shorter. The audio messages, once full of enthusiasm, became monosyllabic. Nighttime conversations gave way to sudden fatigue. I tried to justify it, telling myself it was just work stress. But deep down, a voice insisted, something's changed. He still called me love, but without looking me in the eyes. He gave me quick but undiluted caresses. Even the way he said goodbye in the morning became mechanical. These were details that perhaps others wouldn't notice, but I'd known that man for years, and each change was like a silent warning. The first time I felt real fear was on a Friday night. He said he'd be working late, and without much thought, I decided to stop by the office to pick up a snack. When I arrived, the office was dark, and the receptionist said he'd left early. At that moment, the lie took root in me. I confronted him that night. I asked where he'd been. He laughed and said I was too jealous, that I should trust him more. He spoke so calmly that he almost convinced me. But there was something in his expression, a quick shift in his gaze, that made me swallow hard. I knew it wasn't just fatigue or stress. Gradually, the excuses became routine. It was a meeting. The traffic was horrible. I had to help a colleague. And I accepted it because I still wanted to believe. Loving someone often means closing your eyes to what's already right in front of you, but intuition never shuts up. It just waits for the right moment to scream. One Saturday night, he came back with a perfume that wasn't mine. It was sweet, striking, impossible to ignore. I asked lightly, almost jokingly, and he smiled nervously. I must have bumped into someone in the elevator. That's when I realized how skilled he'd become at making quick excuses. Lying was already part of his routine. I began to observe him more closely. The way he locked his phone with a double password. The sudden trips to the bathroom with the phone in his hand. The calls he only answered when he went out onto the balcony. He built invisible walls between us while I tried to find gaps to see the truth. I began to feel alone in our marriage. We were under the same roof, but in different worlds. I took care of the house, the details, what had always been ours. He, in turn, seemed to live in parallel, as if there was no longer room for me in his life. This distance hurt more than any silence. I remember one night when I waited for him to return until almost 2 a.m. The sound of the key turning in the lock made me freeze. He came in smiling, saying he was with friends. But his wrinkled shirt and the smell of alcohol betrayed another story. I sat on the bed, pretending to sleep, while silent tears wet my pillow. Trust, once shaken, is never the same. I no longer believed his words. I simply observed his gestures. The way he avoided my touch, the way he dressed up more than usual, the way he smiled when reading hidden messages. These were glaring signs that only I seemed to see. My reaction, however, was not explosive. I didn't scream, I didn't make a fuss. I preferred silence because I knew he wouldn't be able to refute concrete evidence. Patience became my weapon, and every detail I recorded was another piece of the puzzle I was piecing together alone. It was during this period that I realized the power of technology. His phone, which had previously been just an accessory, was now the key to everything: location, messages, apps. With every vibration on the table, my body reacted as if it were a warning. I knew the truth was there, hidden in pixels and notifications. Once, during a family dinner, he left to take a call. He returned smiling, but flushed. I asked who it was, and he said a client. The detail was that the phone screen was still reflected in the window. It was a woman's name, accompanied by a heart. I kept this detail to myself without saying a word. From then on, I began to prepare. Not to save the marriage, but to save myself. I opened a hidden folder on my computer. There I saved screenshots, notes, records. Everything that could prove one day that I wasn't crazy. It was the beginning of my own silent investigation. He didn't suspect anything. He continued to act as if I were blind, but with each poorly told lie, I just smiled and pretended to believe it. What he didn't know was that I had already made up my mind. I wouldn't confront him until I was absolutely certain. And that certainty was getting closer. One afternoon, when he said he was going to the gym, I opened the location app. His car didn't stop at the gym. Instead, it parked in front of a cozy restaurant, the kind we used to frequent when we first started dating. The irony was cruel. He was recreating our memories with someone else. I took a deep breath and didn't cry. I wouldn't be a victim of my own naivete. I understood that this wasn't just a physical betrayal but an emotional one. He was giving to another woman the gestures that had once belonged to me. And that was more painful than any explicit image. The nights became long. I lay beside him, but I felt like I no longer knew him. His heavy sleep contrasted with my alert mind. I relived every detail, every lie, every ignored signal. And I wondered how someone could become a stranger after so many years of intimacy. The weight of doubt began to weigh on my body. My appetite vanished, my face drained of color. Friends would ask if I was okay, and I'd say it was just fatigue. But deep down, I knew I was carrying the burden of a secret I hadn't yet had the courage to reveal. Even so, there were days when he tried to deceive me. He'd arrive with flowers, make an unexpected dinner, compliment my dress. Small gestures that confused me, as if he still harbored a flame for me. But then, he'd pull away again, and the cycle would begin again. It was in this back and forth that I realized the manipulation. He didn't just want to deceive me, he wanted to keep me under control. He'd caress me when he sensed my coldness, invent elaborate stories to justify delays. And I, silently, merely collected proof of his skill at lying. Once I found a receipt forgotten in my pants pocket. 2 dinner plates at an expensive restaurant on a Tuesday night. He'd said he'd been in a meeting until late. I held that paper in my hands as if it were a piece of truth finally falling into my lap. I didn't show him anything. I just folded the paper and put it away with the screenshots. It was my way of ensuring that, when the moment came, I wouldn't be accused of paranoia. I would have the evidence, and it would speak for me. Silence became my shield. While he laughed into his phone, I simply watched. While he made excuses, I made mental notes. It was as if I had become an investigator within my own life. And paradoxically, this gave me strength. With each new detail uncovered, the pain lessened and my determination grew. I no longer cried like before. I no longer felt lost. I was preparing for an outcome. He didn't know it, but his acting was numbered. I also began to notice the looks of the people around me. Some friends looked away when asked about him. Coworkers gave short answers. It felt like everyone knew except me. But the difference was that now I was ready to face the truth. The turning point came when I realized I no longer needed him to feel complete. The investigation wasn't just about him, it was about me. About my ability to resist, to see what was hidden, to not be fooled. And that night, seeing him arrive once again with the old soccer excuse, I realized the end was near. My heart no longer beat with fear but with determination. The question was no longer whether I would discover the truth. The question was, how would I use it against him? He always said I was exaggerating. When he noticed my distrust, he made jokes, laughed out loud, and commented to friends, She's jealous, but that's a woman's thing. I smiled on the outside, but inside I felt the pain of being treated like a crazy person. This was his way of disarming me, of making me believe my intuition was worthless. There were days when I almost believed him. When he asked me out at the last minute, when he made dinner for no reason, when he hugged me tighter than usual. I wanted to believe that love still existed. But deep down I knew that sudden effort was just a way to cover up the lie from the night before. He began to reverse roles. Whenever I asked a simple question, he'd respond with another question. Why are you so suspicious of me? Do you have something to hide? The psychological game was cruel. It wasn't enough to lie. He needed to make me feel guilty for asking. I remember one family Sunday. We were at my mother's house, and he was on his phone the entire time. When I asked him to put it away and focus on lunch, he smirked and said, "You even control my time now?" Everyone laughed, but I swallowed hard. It was another moment where my pain was turned into a joke. I started sleeping less. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and see him roll over, clutching his phone. Pretending to sleep, he'd slide his fingers across the screen, smiling to himself in the dark. I'd lie still, tears streaming silently, knowing I was there, lying beside him, but completely invisible. My mind began to fray. Was I really becoming paranoid? Was it all just a figment of my imagination? He repeated this so often that it sometimes seemed convincing. But then a detail, a slip-up, a hidden piece of evidence would emerge, and everything made sense again. The conversations changed tone. When I talked about my days, he'd respond vaguely, without looking me in the eye. But when his phone vibrated, his eyes would sparkle. It was as if he had two lives, one monotonous with me, and another vibrant one on another screen. This duality was slowly destroying me. One ordinary day, when I got home early, I heard a notification echoing through the living room. His phone was on the table. The message said, "I miss you already." My body froze. There was no denying it. It was real. And I knew it hadn't been written by a coworker. When I confronted him that night, he raised his voice. He said I was invading his privacy, that I had no right to go through his things. He turned his back and slammed the bedroom door. That explosive reaction wasn't typical of someone innocent. He was afraid of being discovered. After that fight, he became even more cautious. He changed passwords, set up double locks, and even started turning off his cell phone when he got home. For him, the best way to keep me under control was to limit access to the truth. But what he didn't realize was that each action only further reinforced my certainty. The lies became increasingly elaborate. He told stories about colleagues I'd never met, invented meetings in places I knew there were no offices, and he still tried to convince me I was possessive. The cruelest thing was the calmness with which he spoke, as if he were reciting a rehearsed script. In moments like these, I felt suffocated. It was as if I lived inside a bubble of manipulation. I wanted to believe. I wanted to save what we'd built, but he wouldn't let me out. While blaming me, he created a parallel world where everything seemed normal. One night, I decided to test his excuses. He said he had an emergency meeting at work. I called the company hours later, and the answer was straightforward. No meeting was scheduled. The shock wasn't the lie itself, but the ease with which he fabricated situations. When he returned, I asked how it had gone. He smiled and described in detail a meeting that never took place. It was like a punch in the gut. The way he lied, looking me straight in the eye, was frightening. I realized I wasn't just dealing with an unfaithful husband, but with someone capable of manipulating any truth. That's when I understood the power of gaslighting. He wasn't just betraying me, he was distorting reality. He made me question my own memory, my own sanity. And the more I doubted myself, the more dependent I became on his versions. It was a perverse cycle I needed to break out of. Despite the pain, I remained calm. I took a deep breath, kept smiling, and acted as if I believed everything. But deep inside, something had changed. I was no longer the same woman who was willing to forgive blindly. I was learning to wait for the right moment. Every time he tried to make me feel guilty, I remembered the signs. The perfume that wasn't mine, the forgotten receipt, the message on my phone. These memories were my anchors. When he said I made things up, I knew it wasn't an invention, it was survival. The cruelest part was when he used my love against me. In arguments, he'd say things like, "You don't trust anything, why are you still with me?" I didn't respond because I knew there was no right answer. Any word I said would be twisted and used as a weapon. I began to avoid direct confrontations. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I understood it was pointless. He would always have an excuse, always a prepared argument. The truth could only be revealed another way, with evidence he couldn't deny. A friend once told me, "A woman's intuition never fails." These words echoed in my mind. I might even doubt myself, but my body, my emotions, my eyes saw what he was trying to hide. I just needed to trust myself. Little by little, pain gave way to strategy. I observed his schedule, his excuses, his failures. It was like putting together a puzzle with scattered pieces. And each new lie was another piece that fit together. He noticed my coldness and tried to win me back. He arrived with gifts, made promises of trips, recalled moments from the past. But these gestures no longer held power over me. I no longer melted. I simply watched the play in silence. The manipulation, however, did not stop. One night, he said I was so distant that it seemed he was hiding something. This was the cruelest reversal of all, accusing me of something he did every day. I just smiled, there was nothing more to say. My resistance turned into strength. I no longer cried so much, no longer felt lost. Each lie confirmed that I was on the right path. I didn't need his validation, just my certainty. I remember the look on his face at dinner when I arrived home late from work. He seemed uncomfortable, as if he were the one betrayed. This detail showed me that his greatest weapon was projected insecurity. The more he accused me, the more certain I became of his guilt. The silent nights became my allies. While he slept soundly, I replayed every detail in my mind. The signs were there, clear as daylight, and I no longer needed explanations. I only needed courage. With each passing day, my patience grew. I knew his downfall was inevitable. Sooner or later, proof would emerge that he couldn't hide. I just needed to be ready to use it. My greatest victory was remaining calm. He didn't realize my strength. He thought I was still fragile. But in truth, I was rebuilding myself in silence, and that was more powerful than any scream. The gaslighting no longer had the same effect on me. When he said I was crazy, I just thought, crazy is believing you can deceive forever. My silence confused him, and that was what kept me going. I didn't know how or when, but I was certain of one thing. His mask would fall. And when it did, he would no longer have a way to escape. The truth would come out, and he would be the one to feel the weight of his own lie. After so many denials, I realized there was no point in arguing anymore. He had become an expert at making me doubt myself. Every word I used would be turned against me, as if I were responsible for the deterioration of the relationship. It was painful to realize that, in addition to the betrayal, I was facing a silent psychological war. The arguments were never about the things I was questioning. If I mentioned a suspicious detail, he would change the subject, bring up an old mistake of mine, or even talk about household bills. It was a way to divert attention. And I was often at a loss, unable to understand how a simple question could turn into a huge argument. He mastered the art of reversing roles. When he returned late, I would ask why. The answer was always the same. You control everything. Can't I have my own life? This phrase echoed in my mind. I didn't want control, I just wanted transparency. But he used my doubts as an excuse to distance himself even further. I remember one night when I sat down to talk calmly. I told him I felt his distance, that our relationship felt empty. He looked me in the eye and said, "You're creating problems that don't exist." That destroyed me inside. I sought affection and received indifference. What hurt most wasn't the betrayal itself, but the coldness. The way he managed to treat me as if I were a burden? The man who once promised to be by my side now made me believe I was the problem, and this silent pain was the hardest to bear. He began to be more aggressive with his words. Not shouts, but calculated phrases that stabbed like knives. You're too old for so much insecurity. No one would have the patience for you anymore. Only I can put up with the way you are. I remained silent, swallowing each sentence like poison. This manipulation ate away at me. I woke up in the middle of the night, wondering if I was truly insecure, if I was truly demanding too much. But when I remembered the hidden evidence, my heart told me, no, you're not wrong. He's the one playing against you. At work, I noticed my concentration slipping. I'd find myself staring at the computer screen, unaware of the passing of time. Colleagues would ask if everything was okay, and I'd say yes. But the truth is, I was exhausted from living two lives, the one I showed the world and the one I carried in silence. The feeling of isolation was immense. I didn't want to share my pain with any of my family because I didn't want to worry them. At the same time, I felt ashamed to admit to friends that the man I'd defended so fervently was destroying me. It was a heavy secret, one that sapped my strength every day. The cycle of manipulation was predictable. First the coldness, then the accusation, then an attempt to get closer, as if it were a calculated game to keep me trapped. I already understood the pattern, but even so it was difficult to free myself emotionally. The fear of losing everything we'd built paralyzed me. One of the worst situations happened at a friend's party. While I was talking, I noticed he'd walked away to answer his phone. When I looked back, I saw his face illuminated by the screen, smiling like he hadn't smiled at me in a long time. As I approached, he quickly put away the phone. He feigned casualness, but I already knew. That smile was on target. Sometimes I thought about giving up on everything, packing my bags and leaving. But I quickly remembered everything I'd been through with him, every achievement, every real moment we'd shared. And I wondered, had it all been a lie from the start, or had he simply changed over time? This doubt was what destroyed me most. It wasn't just about the betrayal, it was about the history we'd built. Because if he lied so easily now, how could I believe the past was true? It was like living in a house where the walls are starting to crack, and you don't know if the foundation was always fragile. He started using work as his favorite excuse. Last-minute meeting, traveling to solve problems. I knew many of these situations were fabricated, but without concrete proof, it was pointless to confront him. So I smiled and pretended to believe, while inside I braced myself for the moment when the mask would slip. The cryptic messages that appeared at odd hours became frequent. Codes, nicknames, short words. He thought I didn't notice, but every detail was a punch in the gut. I no longer needed to imagine. The truth was right in front of me. I also noticed his behavior change toward me. When he wanted to hide something, he'd be attentive, affectionate, as if he were the same man from years ago. But soon after, the coldness returned. It was as if he had two faces, and I never knew which one I'd find when I got home. The worst was when he made me feel invisible. We'd sit together on the couch, but it was as if I didn't exist. He'd laugh to himself, respond to messages, and I'd sit beside him in silence. The loneliness of being together yet completely apart is a pain no one should bear. My self-esteem began to suffer. I'd look in the mirror and wonder if I'd aged too much, if I'd lost my spark. Every comment from him, every slight, fueled this doubt, until I realized it wasn't about me. It was about the cruel way he chose to manipulate me. And when I asked him about the future, he'd change the subject. He'd talk about soccer, politics, anything but us. It was as if I were an uncomfortable presence, someone he tolerated only out of convenience. This indifference was as painful as the betrayal itself. The excuses were repeated so often that they became memorized in my mind. Traffic, meeting, dead phone. He'd forget he'd used the same explanations before, and I saved each repetition as further proof of his carelessness. One time, I decided to secretly record an audio recording. I turned on my phone and left it on the table while he was on the phone. Then, alone, I heard every word. He laughed, called someone honey, and made plans for the weekend. It was like being hit in the chest. I had the proof I'd been searching for. I didn't show him anything at that moment. I saved the audio and listened to it over and over as if needing to convince myself I wasn't crazy. It was real, it was recorded, and no one could deny it. That was the confirmation my intuition had always screamed. After that, I began observing even more coldly. Every gesture he made, every message, every outing. I no longer cried, I analyzed, as if I had stopped being a wife and become an investigator within my own life. The weight of the lies began to suffocate even him. Sometimes I noticed his nervousness, his quick responses, his sudden mood swings. It was clear he feared being discovered. But he continued to believe I was under his control. The curious thing was that when I remained silent, he became restless. Accustomed to seeing me question, he found my silence strange. This was my greatest weapon, letting him think I had given up. Meanwhile, I only strengthened my evidence. The sleepless nights were no longer of despair, but of strategy. I relived every detail, analyzed every pattern, connected the dots. I knew I was getting closer and closer to a revelation that would change everything. It wasn't just about discovering the betrayal. It was about freeing myself from the manipulation, the psychological game, the weight of carrying a lie around at home. I wanted more than being caught red-handed. I wanted emotional justice. This new strength began to transform me. I no longer saw myself as a victim, but as someone ready to turn the page. And this change was visible. Even my gaze in the mirror had a new firmness. I was preparing myself for what was to come. He had no idea the woman I was becoming. While I thought he was still manipulating me, I was already planning every step of my next move. His downfall was inevitable, and I would be ready to watch. In that early morning, as he slept soundly beside me, I realized the end of the silence was near. The proof was in my hands. All that remained was to decide the exact moment to use it all. And when that day came, there would be no turning back. The smell was the first clue that night. He came home with a sweet perfume clinging to his shirt, completely different from what I was wearing. I asked lightly, almost laughing, if he'd changed his fragrance. He replied too quickly, "I must have brushed against someone in the elevator." That excuse echoed within me like a warning impossible to ignore. I shrugged that detail off. I'd learned that haste was the enemy of certainty. Instead of confronting it, I chose to observe. I carefully folded my shirt and smelled the lingering scent again. It was too striking to be an elevator thing. It was the signal I needed to commit to memory. The next day, I noticed he came out looking more polished than usual. He sprayed on perfume, changed his shirt twice, and fixed his hair with a care he hadn't seen in years. He said he had an important meeting at work, but his expression wasn't one of professional pressure. It was one of eagerness to meet him. I went to work with my head full. I found myself distracted in front of the computer, wondering who was on the other end of his anxiety. It was impossible not to think about all the recent details, hidden messages, smiles in the dark, repeated apologies. Everything connected cruelly. I decided not to tell anyone. I kept everything to myself. I felt like if I told him, I'd hear phrases like, "You're seeing things where they don't exist." It was better to carry it alone. After all, no one knew that man as well as I did. I was certain something was wrong. Over time, the scents began to appear more frequently. One day sweet, another woody, another floral. None of them were mine. It was as if each week, a piece of his life was scented by another presence. It gnawed at me, but it also strengthened me. I started checking his pants pockets. Once I found a bar receipt with a date and time that didn't match his excuse. Another time, a hotel parking receipt. They weren't complete proof, but they were glaring signs of a double routine. I kept everything to myself. The nights grew longer. I'd lie down and wait for him, pretending to sleep, just to smell him when he entered the room. Often he'd come with the scent of alcohol and perfume mixed together. I'd turn over, silent, and let the tears fall onto the pillow. He sensed my coldness, but misinterpreted it. He thought I was just tired. And that worked in my favor. Because while he relaxed, believing in my silence, I was piecing together a painful puzzle piece by piece. The cruelest thing was the contrast. Some days he'd arrive affectionately, bringing a dessert I liked or preparing dinner. These gestures confused my heart. But soon after, he'd disappear for hours, making it clear that those affectionate gestures were just cover-up to cover up the lie. I remember one Friday in particular. He said he'd be staying late at work, but his cell phone's location showed a distant neighborhood. It was a discreet bar, one of those hidden among residential streets. I knew it wasn't a mistake. This wasn't work. I took a deep breath and took a screenshot. I saved it in a hidden folder on my phone. It was no longer just intuition, it was evidence. I now had in my hands the proof he could never deny. But even so, I kept it, because it wasn't time to use it yet. The game of observation consumed me. I needed to smile during the day, work normally, maintain a semblance of routine, but inside I lived on constant alert. It was like walking on minefields. Every detail could be a bomb about to explode. I also began to notice the times of his messages. I always received notifications around midnight. I pretended to be asleep, but I listened to the discreet sound of vibration. He would get up slowly, go to the balcony, and stay there whispering. It was impossible not to notice that there was someone on the other end of the line. In those moments, my chest burned with pent-up rage. I wanted to scream, to snatch the phone from his hand, but I restrained myself. This wasn't the time to expose myself. I needed to be stronger than my pain. I needed to maintain control, because this battle wasn't one of impulse, it was one of intelligence. He began to arrive with increasingly elaborate excuses. He would invent names of colleagues, stories about clients, unexpected trips. I listened silently, memorizing every detail, because I knew that sooner or later, one of these versions would contradict itself. This coldness of mine began to bother him. He'd say I was distant, that I wasn't the same anymore. And I'd respond with a brief smile, "It's just tiredness." Deep down, I knew the real tiredness came from the lies he'd created. There was a family dinner where he spent almost the entire time on his phone. When I discreetly asked, he said, "It's work, you don't understand." My mother glanced at me sideways, as if sensing something. I lowered my eyes and pretended everything was fine. His indifference began to hurt me more than the suspicion of betrayal. Not only was he with someone else, but he no longer made any effort to hide it. It was as if I'd stopped mattering. This feeling crushed me, but also pushed me forward. One day, while doing the laundry, I found a folded napkin in his pants pocket. There was a red lipstick mark on the corner. I held that piece of paper with trembling hands. It was the embodiment of what I already knew. It wasn't imagination, it wasn't exaggeration. It was betrayal all over the place. I put the napkin away with the other evidence. My secret folder already contained screenshots, invoices, receipts, and now even a forgotten lipstick. With each new item, I felt closer to the end. He had no idea that his own inattention was leading to his downfall. Even so, he continued to treat me like I was crazy. He'd say things like, "You create stories in your head. You need to trust me more. You're the only one who sees problems where there aren't any." These words hurt, but they didn't have as much effect, because now I had real proof. Deep down, I knew my silence made him uncomfortable. He expected reactions, expected confrontation, because he knew he had ready excuses. But when I didn't question him, he was left speechless, and that was exactly what I wanted, to leave him confused. The trips to the soccer field became more and more frequent, but the truth is, the field was no longer part of his routine. The bar, the secret meetings, and the perfume betrayed me much more than any kick of the ball. One of those days, he returned later than usual. I entered the bathroom shortly after him and noticed a detail: his hastily shaved beard. The overspray of perfume to mask other smells. It was as if he were trying to wipe away invisible traces, unaware that he was already marked in every detail. This parallel life he tried to lead began to clash with our routine. He forgot appointments, changed dates, even lied about times I knew by heart. The mistakes mounted, and I seized each one to bolster my evidence base. I no longer had any doubts. The man I'd shared so many years with was now just a shadow, and that shadow carried secrets that would soon be exposed. My pain was no longer one of uncertainty, but of preparing for impact. The nights grew colder. Even under the same blanket, it felt like a chasm between us. He slept soundly, while I watched the ceiling, mentally planning every step I would take when the time came. Silence became my strength. He thought I didn't see, didn't feel, didn't know. But I saw everything. And the most painful thing for him would be discovering that I'd let him dig his own grave without realizing it. And that morning, when I saw my phone vibrate on the nightstand once again, I knew the bomb was about to explode. The difference is that this time, I was ready to witness the consequences with my own eyes. The confirmation came on an ordinary night, one of those when I expected nothing. I was home, alone, when I received a notification from the location app he hadn't even remembered existed. The dot on the map blinked steadily. It wasn't the gym, it wasn't work. It was a discreet, brightly lit bar, late at night. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my heart. I grabbed the car keys and drove there. The drive seemed longer than ever. At every turn, my mind conjured up possible scenarios, but nothing compared to what I saw when I arrived. He was there, sitting, laughing, accompanied by someone. His laughter stabbed me. It wasn't the restrained laughter he offered me at home. It was an open, lively laugh, as if he'd forgotten I existed. His gaze shone in a way it hadn't for me in a long time, and it hurt more than any physical betrayal. She was beside him, leaning in, lightly touching his arm. A simple, intimate, yet devastating gesture. I watched as he held her hand on the table as if it were the most natural gesture in the world. The man who had told me he was into soccer was now before me, living another life. I stood still for a few minutes, watching from afar. My body trembled, my hands sweating, but I knew I had to capture that moment. I took my phone out of my pocket and took a picture. The captured image was harsh but necessary, proof he could never deny. The scene seemed frozen, but my mind was spinning at high speed. I remembered every excuse, every strange perfume, every receipt. Everything made sense there in that moment. The truth no longer needed to be imagined. It was before my eyes, vivid and cruel. I wanted to cross the room and scream, expose everything right then and there. But I restrained myself. I understood that exploding at that moment would give him the chance to reverse the situation, to accuse me of exaggeration. I needed to be colder than the pain burning inside me. I left the place unseen. I drove home in silence, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just let the image of them together become etched like a painful tattoo in my memory. I knew this would be the turning point. When I got home, I sat on the couch and stared into space. The clock read almost midnight. He wouldn't arrive until hours later, with the same old excuse about soccer or the meeting. And for once, I wasn't devastated. I was determined. When he finally came in, he acted as always. He left his keys on the table, took off his shoes, and went straight to the bathroom. His routine seemed like a memorized script. But this time, I saw him differently. I no longer saw a husband. I saw an actor poorly performing his play. I sat on the bed and pretended to be sleepy. He lay down beside me, turned his back, and picked up his cell phone. The scene repeated itself like so many other nights. But inside me, something had changed. I was no longer a silent accomplice, I was the owner of the truth. The next day, I woke up early and observed his still sleeping expression. Who would have thought such a familiar face could hide so much? It was strange to realize I no longer felt love there, only distance. As if sleeping next to a stranger wearing the mask of a husband. I spent the week acting normal, but increasingly distant inside. He tried to maintain the act, sometimes with attention, sometimes with indifference. I, however, no longer reacted the same way. He believed he was in control, but I was now the one guiding the game. One night he mentioned how tired he was from work. I smiled and simply nodded. As he spoke, I remembered the scene at the bar, the touch of hands, the open laughter. And I realized that nothing he said from then on would have any value. I had already seen the truth without filters. The cruelest thing was realizing that, even knowing there was another woman, my body still reacted to her presence. Years of habit don't break overnight. I felt the weight of habit, but also the lightness of knowing I was freeing myself. I avoided telling anyone. I kept the photos secret, along with the other evidence. It was my silent weapon, my fortress. I knew that, when the time came, that record would have the power to turn everything against him. I began to pay attention to details that had previously gone unnoticed. The way he typed quickly, smiled to himself, dressed up excessively for simple outings. Each gesture was further confirmation that his parallel life was no longer just suspicious, it was an established routine. At times I considered following him again, but I realized there was no need. I already had enough. The real challenge wasn't collecting evidence, but deciding how and when to use it. This choice became my greatest dilemma. The pain didn't disappear, but it changed form. It was no longer the desperation of someone who suspects. It was the cold rage of someone who knows. A rage that gave me strength, that made me walk with the certainty that I wouldn't be deceived forever. When he hugged me, I remembered the scene at the bar. When he said I love you, I remembered the open smile he'd shared with someone. When he left the house, I remembered the touch of hands. This constant comparison was painful but also strengthening. I no longer wanted to believe, I wanted to react. His conversations began to sound even more artificial. When he asked about my day, it felt like an obligation. When he said he was tired, it felt like a rehearsal. I saw the emptiness behind every word. And that made me certain that our relationship was in ruins. the silence between us grew. It was no longer the comfortable silence of those who understand each other. It was a heavy silence, full of things unsaid, full of hidden truths. I endured it, but with the knowledge that I was laying the groundwork. At times, he tried to be more affectionate. He offered me coffee, complimented my hair, told me he missed me. I just smiled, but inside I thought, what's this longing for if your life is already with someone else? It was a cruel game, but I was no longer the same vulnerable piece. With each new lie, I felt stronger. It was as if his insistence on hiding only reinforced my clarity. He dug his own hole, and I just watched, waiting for the moment to give the final push. I started taking better care of myself. Not for him, but for myself. I went back to walking, changed small habits, looked at myself in the mirror more firmly. It was a way of reminding myself that I didn't depend on him to exist. He noticed this change. He asked if I was doing anything different, if anyone was complimenting me. I smiled and simply said, maybe I'm learning to value myself again. I saw his expression change. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. This fear gave me more strength. It was proof that my coldness was having an effect. He no longer had the same confidence, no longer felt as in control. I had shifted the scales without saying a single word. Increasingly, I saw signs of nervousness in him. He forgot little things, got dates wrong, contradicted himself. It was as if his mind could no longer hold so many versions. I simply registered them mentally, waiting for the moment when everything would come to light. The day of his downfall was approaching. I could feel it. It was no longer a matter of suspicion or accumulated evidence. It was a matter of time, and I was prepared to watch his mask crumble without having to raise my voice. That night, while he slept, I picked up my phone and looked at the photo from the bar once more. His smile for another woman was like a bullet to the chest, but at the same time, it was the weapon I needed to turn the story around, and when I used it, nothing would ever be the same. The shock of the discovery didn't make me scream or explode. On the contrary, it plunged me into a profound silence. I walked through the house as if it were a battlefield, analyzing every detail, his every reaction. The man sleeping next to me had no idea I already knew almost everything. I decided my greatest weapon would be self-control. While he made excuses, I responded with short, emotionless sentences. He was surprised, trying to elicit a reaction, but I remained firm. Deep down, I knew my silence disturbed him more than any confrontation. It was like carrying a secret he couldn't possibly imagine. I had already seen his other life. I already had proof, and he continued to believe he was deceiving me. This false sense of power was precisely what strengthened me. Each time he invented a new commitment, I no longer felt pain. I felt strategy. I mentally jotted down the details, made connections, waited for the slip-ups. And they came inevitably, because no one can sustain a lie for so long without failing. One night, he said he was going to sleep at a friend's house after soccer. I waited for him to leave, and, with a tap on the location app, saw he wasn't where he said he was. My chest tightened, but at the same time, I smiled to myself. I no longer needed to imagine. I knew. The most shocking thing was realizing how he underestimated my intelligence. He thought a smile, a hug, any excuse would suffice. Little did he realize that, all the while I was building a fortress of certainties that would one day crumble on him. Time seemed to flow differently. The hours he was away were long and heavy, but at the same time, they became useful. I took advantage of each absence to organize tests, review conversations, connect the dots. My heart still ached, but my mind was already working silently. Some days he tried to regain ground. He would arrive with small gifts, chocolates, flowers, even dinner invitations. But none of it had any effect anymore. I saw it all as a cheap rehearsal by someone who knew he was hanging by a thread, but still believed in his own cleverness. One night in particular stood out. He approached me affectionately, cupped my face, and said, "I don't know what I would do without you." The phrase, which once would have moved me, now sounded like mockery. I just looked into his eyes and thought, "You'll soon find out what you'd do without me." The silence began to weigh on him. He was used to seeing me react, argue, demand explanations. When I stopped doing that, he was lost. My lack of reaction became his greatest enemy. And that was exactly what I wanted. He began to contradict himself. Sometimes he forgot what he'd said, mixed up dates, confused stories. Small lapses that, to him, were details but to me were confirmations. I mentally noted each one like someone saving ammunition for the right moment. With each contradiction, my gaze changed. I didn't need to say anything, I just observed. And I noticed that he grew uncomfortable, avoided my gaze, changed the subject. Power had shifted hands, and I was the only one who clearly perceived it. It was at that moment that I understood that anger could be my ally. Not the explosive kind, but the cold, calculated kind that transforms pain into strategy. And this transformation began to give me a new kind of strength. Sometimes I caught myself smiling to myself, remembering that he believed he was in control. This smile wasn't one of happiness, it was one of resilience. It was the smile of someone who is no longer a victim, but a strategist, of someone who knows their downfall is near. At family gatherings, I noticed that some eyes were already suspicious. My mother noticed my silence, my sisters exchanged glances. I said nothing, gave no signs, but I knew that sooner or later, everyone would understand. Every time he left, I looked in the mirror. I experienced a mixture of pain and liberation. The pain of seeing my marriage crumble, and the liberation of realizing I no longer depended on him for survival. I grew stronger in silence. Mutual friends began to act strangely. Some avoided talking about him, others looked at me with pity. It was as if everyone knew a piece of the truth, but no one had the courage to tell me. I smiled and pretended not to notice, but deep down, I already knew. One night I overheard him talking on the phone. I was in the bathroom, speaking softly, but the echo made it clear. It was a female voice. He was laughing, promising to meet her soon. I remained silent, etching that sound into my memory like more invisible evidence. The irony was that the more evidence I accumulated, the less I needed it to believe. I no longer needed external confirmation. The truth was imprinted in every gesture, in every smile that wasn't meant for me, in every silence that hid secrets. Still, I kept it all bottled up. Not for myself, but so that, at the right moment, no one could question me. Because I knew he, as always, would try to turn the tables. But this time, I would have answers he couldn't deny. There were days when I wanted to explode. I wanted to throw the photos on the table, expose every detail, end it all once and for all. But I held back. Haste was the enemy of victory. I wanted more than a confrontation. I wanted a turnaround. He began to notice changes in my behavior. He'd ask if I was okay, if something had happened. I just smiled and said I was tired. This kind of response made him uneasy, because he no longer had emotional control over me. My body reacted differently. I no longer cried like before, I no longer felt fragile. The pain was still there but transformed into energy. It was as if every tear I held back had become fuel for my strength. I also sensed his attempts to justify himself before even being questioned. He would arrive with detailed stories, inventing elaborate excuses. And I simply listened in silence without interrupting. He talked too much, and this over-explanation was the greatest proof of his guilt. The manipulation that once shook me no longer had any effect. When he said I was exaggerating, I only thought, exaggeration is thinking you can lie forever. It was as if his words no longer carried weight. Over time, his discomfort grew. He no longer knew how to react to my silence. He tried to elicit a reaction, but I remained firm. And this emptiness left him more exposed than any question I could. I began to perceive his insecurity in the details. The way he looked at his phone, how he avoided leaving it alone, how he double-checked his messages. He was constantly on alert, afraid of being discovered, unaware that I already knew. This feeling of holding the truth in my hands empowered me. I no longer needed to chase, no longer needed to beg for explanations. The truth was with me, and it was only a matter of time before I laid it on the table. Every time I looked at him, I saw not only a traitor, but a man unaware of the power he had awakened within me. His lie destroyed me, but it also rebuilt me. And this reconstruction was what prepared me for the outcome. One silent night, as he slept beside me, I realized my decision had already been made. I no longer wanted just confirmation, I wanted to act. Doubt no longer existed. All that remained was the right time to show that I had never been blind. From that moment on, I knew there was no turning back. I was no longer just a deceived wife. I was a woman who carried the truth hidden within her, His every move was watched, every detail noted. The tables had turned, even if he didn't know it yet. I started noticing his response time to messages. When he was with me, he took a while to reply to anyone. But as soon as he was away for a few minutes, his fingers would fly across the screen. The discreet smile, the change in his breathing, everything betrayed what he was trying to hide. One Monday morning, I found a note forgotten inside the car. The handwriting wasn't his. It was just 3 words. It was wonderful yesterday. I folded the paper and kept it. I didn't cry. I didn't confront him. I simply added another piece to my collection of evidence. The ironic thing was that the more he lied, the more predictable he became. Always the same excuse, always the same stories. He didn't realize that repetition was his greatest flaw, and each failure made me more certain of what was about to happen. I began keeping the house impeccably tidy, not because I wanted to please him, but because I knew that soon I would be the one deciding who stayed and who went. It was like preparing the ground for a big reveal while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Sometimes he'd compliment me out of the blue, as if to make up for his guilt. "You look beautiful today." I don't know what I'd do without you. Beautiful words, but hollow. I no longer received them as I used to. Each compliment seemed like an attempt to mask the weight of his lies. Silence became my sharpest weapon. I didn't ask, didn't question, just observed. And that made him uneasy. He expected a reaction that never came, and this absence made him stumble over his own justifications. The small slips began to pile up. A dinner receipt, a forgotten shirt with perfume on it, a lipstick mark on a glass. It all added up. I didn't need to look too hard because the evidence fell into my lap. It was as if life itself was showing me the way. One night, he left his unlocked phone on the table. I didn't need to break in, but a notification appeared before my eyes. "I miss you already, love." My heart raced, but I took a deep breath. I didn't make a fuss. I just smiled inside because I'd had more than enough. The difference now was how I faced everything. Before, I felt like a victim. Now, I felt prepared. I no longer wanted just confirmation. I wanted to transform the truth into liberation. And this change in attitude made all the difference. The people around me began to notice my firmer gaze. I was no longer the dejected woman. I was someone silent, but with the strength difficult to explain. I didn't need to say anything. My posture said it all. Something was about to happen. He, in turn, seemed increasingly lost. He tried to maintain the same act, but he no longer had the same confidence. The apologies came too quickly. The affectionate gestures felt false. I sensed the fear disguised in every word. It was during this period that I decided to start taking better care of myself. I went back to the gym, made overdue doctor appointments, and got a haircut. Small changes that represented something bigger. I was finding myself again, preparing for a life beyond him. With each glance in the mirror, I saw less pain and more determination. The face that had once been lined with fatigue now reflected determination. I no longer wondered if I could move on. The question was only when and how. The nights remained the greatest field of observation. The way he tossed and turned in bed, the way he hid his cell phone, the way he smiled in the dark. I saw it all, absorbed it all, but I no longer suffered in the same way. It was like watching a movie whose ending I already knew, and yet he continued to believe he was deceiving me. This was the cruelest and, at the same time, the most liberating part. He thought he had the power, but I was the one already carrying the decision in my hands. One Sunday, over breakfast, he talked about taking a trip together. His eyes didn't convey truth. It was just an attempt to maintain balance. I smiled and agreed. But deep down, I knew that trip would never happen. I no longer needed to prove anything to myself. The question now was how he would fall, whether it would be silently, just between us, or in front of everyone. This decision grew inside me like an inextinguishable fire. And every time he left the house, I wondered if the time had come. But I always decided to wait a little longer. Not out of fear, but because I wanted the fall to be complete, with no chance of recovery. That night, as he slept soundly beside me, I realized the moment was closer than ever. I had all the pieces of the puzzle in my hands. All that was left was to fit them together in front of him. And when that happened, nothing would ever be the same. That week, I noticed he was more restless than usual. He changed his clothes several times before going out, sprayed on excessive perfume, and checked his phone every few minutes. His nervousness was so evident that even a stranger would notice. To me, it was simply confirmation that something big was coming. I no longer reacted to his excuses, just watched. This calmness of mine unnerved him more than any argument. He seemed to be waiting for me to question him, to create a scene, but silence became my most powerful shield. He didn't know how to handle it. One night, he left his car unlocked in the garage. Inside was a bag with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. It wasn't a gift for me, I was sure of it. I held the glasses for a few seconds, took a deep breath, and returned them to their original location. The blow needed to be delivered at the right time. The most curious thing was how clever he believed he was. He'd come home smiling, talking about his hard work, and even complaining about muscle aches as if he'd been playing soccer. I listened and nodded, knowing that each word was another line in the script for his own downfall. At work, I was already different. Colleagues noticed my renewed focus, my firmer posture. They didn't know it, but that transformation stemmed from the certainty I carried. When you know the truth, you no longer need to justify yourself. And that changes the way you walk through the world. A friend invited me out for coffee. I simply told her he was acting strangely, without going into details. She said, "You deserve better than this." That sentence kept lingering in my head. For the first time, it didn't sound like comfort, but like confirmation. At home, he tried to create moments of normalcy. He'd put on a movie, offer popcorn, lie down next to me. But his touch was empty, his presence cold. I no longer saw a husband there. I saw only a man trying to maintain a worn-out disguise. Love doesn't survive rehearsals. The turning point came when he asked me to borrow money for a project at work. I knew it was a lie. Not only because of the hesitation in his voice, but because I'd seen restaurant and hotel expense statements. This wasn't carelessness, it was abuse. He was using what was ours to fuel what was his alone. I felt a mixture of anger and clarity. The physical betrayal was painful enough, but realizing he was using our home, our money, and our time to sustain this charade was unbearable. That moment, I realized the line of tolerance had been crossed. With each new night, my mind mapped out the confrontation. I didn't know yet whether to do it quietly, simply showing evidence, or to let everyone know. But something inside me no longer accepted hiding. The truth needed to be exposed, no matter the cost. At a dinner party, I noticed that even his demeanor had changed. He avoided my gaze, laughed to himself, looking at his phone, and became irritated when I brought up serious matters. It was like living with a teenager hiding secrets, not a middle-aged man who should have been a life partner. The saddest thing was realizing that even our bed was no longer the same. He slept facing the opposite side, keeping his phone under the pillow. It was the most painful proof that there was no longer intimacy, just 2 bodies sharing the same physical space. I was no longer afraid of what was to come. Fear had transformed into strength. My silence was no longer omission, it was strategy. And that strategy was getting closer and closer to reaching its peak. He had no idea of the storm he was about to face. One night, as I closed my eyes, I thought about everything I'd endured. Strange perfumes, hidden laughter, suspicious messages, empty apologies. And I realized that, despite everything, I was still standing. He'd tried to tear me down with lies, but without realizing it, he'd taught me to be stronger. And it was that early morning, amid the heavy silence of the room, that I understood. It was no longer a matter of finding out, it was a matter of showing. I already held the right cards in my hand. I just needed to choose the moment to play them. And that moment was coming with greater force than ever. The day seemed normal, but inside me, there was no room for doubt. I looked at him drinking coffee and realized how strange his presence had become. The man who once promised me a partnership now seemed like just a character. The silence between us spoke louder than 1,000 words, and I already carried the truth within me. I thought about how many women experience the same thing without the courage to admit it. How many hear you're jealous while their hearts scream? It wasn't just about me. It was about all those who endure in silence. Betrayal is not just kissing someone else, but daily disrespect. And I no longer wanted to be complicit in that. For a long time I wondered if the problem was with me. If I had gotten older, lost my shine, stopped being interesting. But looking in the mirror, I realized it wasn't me. It was him. The cowardice of making choices, the lack of character, the constant manipulation. That was never love. Society loves to blame women. They say we are insecure, dramatic, exaggerated. But no one backs down when the truth comes out. I learned that female intuition is powerful. She doesn't make mistakes, she just waits for the right time to be confirmed. While he smiled and pretended to be normal, I no longer reacted like I used to. The calm I found left him insecure. Every excuse sounded false, every gesture seemed rehearsed. He thought he was in control, but he didn't know that his downfall was already inevitable. The most painful thing was realizing that the love was over. What remained was attachment, fear, and shame of admitting the truth. But the heart does not feed on crumbs, and I was tired of living in the shadow of lies. I didn't want to survive anymore, I wanted to truly live. Clarity brought unexpected peace. It wasn't happiness, but it was firmness. The certainty that I wouldn't carry a weight alone that wasn't mine. I no longer planned to just find out, but to show. The truth needed to come out of silence and become liberation. And it was that morning that I understood the confrontation would not just be between me and him. It would be between dignity and manipulation, between truth and lies. The moment was getting closer and closer. And when it arrived, there would be no room for excuses, only for revelation.